So you've been hearing and reading about the word feminism in social media a lot. You might wonder, what is it with feminism? And how does one become a feminist? With more access to knowledge and information in this age, it might be the case that, maybe some of you already have an idea of what is this F word about. Or perhaps some of you already identify yourselves as feminists. But what is feminism really? What is its relationship with philosophy, specifically in ethics? How do we think about our moral problems as feminists? So for this lecture, we will try to answer all these questions and learn about feminist ethics. So the study of feminist thought compels us to start with a basic presupposition. And you have to remember this. We have to take note that women are historically subordinated, women are excluded and disadvantaged in this patriarchal society. Recognizing this fact is one of the first steps in understanding feminism. With this richness of feminist scholarship and diversity of approaches in feminist thought, of course, it would be very hard to come by a very precise definition of feminism. After all, feminists resist categorizations, essentialism. So one that would perfectly capture this diversity is to describe feminism as intersectional, as interlocking, and interdisciplinary. So it makes more sense to talk about feminism as feminisms, and that there is no one way of doing feminism. So feminists, while disagreeing to assign a tight definition to feminism, of course they agree on some core commitments and values. So the first one is the recognition that women are systemically and historically oppressed. The second one, which is as much as important as the first, is that this needs to change. That we have to do something about it. We ought to do something about it. So you see, feminism has always emphasized the importance of both theory and practice, the marriage of theory and practice. So in these commitments, we will see how the goals of feminism are both on a theoretical and practical level. So how does it happen? Okay, theoretically, we aim to identify these oppressive structures that contribute to women's subordination. So we look at the different biases present in this sense in feminist philosophy and in ethics. And practically, we aim to develop accounts and analysis of women's experiences. So we look at the lived experiences of women, their identities, their social contexts. With this, feminism, of course, aside from it is a socio-political movement, it is a conscious effort to end all forms of oppression against women and other marginalized groups. That is correct. Not only for women, but also marginalized groups. A lot of feminists will also argue that feminism actually benefits everyone. We have to note, though, that even before feminism was a formal movement, women have long been resisting and fighting for equality and emancipation. Feminism, then, is women's resistance to patriarchy. For decades, philosophy has been a vital arena for feminists. But because of the history of marginalization, of exclusion of women from doing philosophy, the traditional way of doing philosophy has neglected women's concerns and issues, thereby making philosophy androcentric and masculinist in terms of their way of thinking. So in this sense, we can say that it's a male-dominated discipline. Feminist philosophy has been the response to this androcentrism, to this masculinist way of thinking. And feminist philosophers develop new methods of analysis. They give birth to new ideas, to fresh perspectives. They criticize the traditional areas of philosophy. They articulated women's issues philosophically. And of course, they identify these biases and they counter these biases. So in this attempt to transform not only philosophy, but also the lives of women and their experiences, feminist philosophers have scrutinized philosophical works and theories that have neglected and excluded women's experiences, especially in theorizing and philosophizing. One of the most developed areas where we can see this kind of transformation is, of course, in ethics. So what is feminist ethics? All right, feminist ethics is essentially a response to traditional ethics, to the traditional way of doing ethics, which is, of course, as we have identified a while ago, it is male-dominated, it is androcentric and masculinist. So the goals of feminist ethics, of course, is first to locate and correct male biases in traditional ethics and to develop moral accounts that consider women's moral and social location. So feminist ethics, in a sense, starts with the conviction that women's subordination is morally wrong. So in this sense, feminist ethics is a critical perspective in Western or traditional male bias ethics. And the goal is to engage in constant reconceptualization and re-evaluation of the central ethical problems. Well, the term feminist ethics has only been used in the late 1970s or perhaps early 1980s, despite a long history of overlapping issues that concerned women and gender questions and ethical debates. Feminists believe that the existing traditional ethical theories won't be sufficient to address women's issues. So they look at the various philosophical or ethical theories and concepts in philosophy, and they realize, it's not going to be fruitful to talk about these issues using the same framework. So to cite some early important works that articulated these issues, we include Mary Astle's A Serious Proposal to the Ladies for the Advancement of Their True and Greatest Interests. We remember Mary Wollstonecraft, her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which is a very important work during the first wave of feminism, during women's fight for equality and suffrage. We have John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women. We have Harriet Taylor Mill's The Enfranchisement of Women. And of course, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which is a seminal work during the second wave of feminism. So the clamor then was, of course, emancipation from all the patriarchal institutions and structures that oppress women. And lastly, of course, is Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice. Now, to understand deeper the feminist approaches to ethics, let's take a look at the main feminist criticisms of traditional or Western ethics. So along with these challenges posed to the application of traditional ethics, feminist philosophers also raise challenges to the very moral concepts, theories, and methods. So according to feminist philosopher Alison Jagger, we can identify these challenges and can be grouped under the following. The first one is the lack of concern for women's interests. So feminists are saying that there is a lack of interest in philosophizing in the traditional Western ethics. The second is the neglect of women's issues. The third, denial of women's moral agency. Fourth is depreciation of feminine values. And lastly is the devaluation of women's moral experience. So for the first one, let's look at the first challenge, the first feminist criticism. It's the lack of concern for women's interests. So this has been evident in various works of male philosophers in the history of philosophy. And because of the historical exclusion of women from the public, male philosophers have theorized moral problems from their own socially privileged positions. Since women are only viewed as instrumental in the male-dominated institutions, like family, like the state, the government, their concerns were not really taken into consideration in our moral debates and inquiries. For the second challenge, there had been clear neglect of women's issues. Male philosophers upheld the public and private split distinction. So this means that they left out the domestic sphere, saying that the home, that the household is beyond the scope of political regulation. And that is very interesting because, head of households are paradigmatically males. But we know that the domestic sphere is where women are historically confined to. So the private was in a sense beyond political intervention and regulation, and thus beyond the issues of economy and justice. Well, up until today, for sure, we still hear some arguments that reduce domestic violence to a private problem, that it's just the private affair of the couples, of families, thereby making it more difficult for women to come forward. And this devaluation of women's issues has all the more justified, legitimated, and perpetuated women's oppression in society. Now, for the third challenge, this emphasizes the long-standing assumption that women are inferior to men. So not only in terms of rational capacity, our capacity for reason, to think for ourselves, but also agency, autonomy, and thus moral reasoning. So some philosophers like Aristotle, Kant, Rousseau, they have elaborated on this in their works. And feminists question the overriding authority of rationality in morality. Now, for the fourth criticism or challenge of the feminists to traditional way of doing ethics, traditional moral theory assigns positive and higher value to masculine traits or attributes. So the feminine traits such as emotion, body, interdependence, nature, care, and community, even empathy, they are considered inferior. In contrast to, of course, the masculine values, which are the values of autonomy, independence, intellect, will, and even hierarchy. So Western moral theories assume moral agents to be autonomous, to be rational, to be free, and independent beings, thus associating individualism with masculinity. So this is in contrast with women's perspectives, which are more influenced by social and interpersonal relationships. So feminists, they reject reason-based moral theories. Why? Because these kinds of theories tend to discount perspectives of emotions, feelings, perceptiveness, and even imagination. All right, now for the last challenge, or for the last criticism, the overall location and treatment of women's experience in traditional ethics, this results in the general devaluation of women's moral experiences. Moral theories under Western ethics, they have this sort of, excessive preoccupation with rules, with abstract principles, with abstract theories. And women's experiences, lived experiences, and identities are not taken into context. So you see the diversity and variety of oppressions women face as a result of their gender, their race, their class, their sexuality, and even ableness are disregarded. And these social divisions are deemed crucial to understanding morality and oppression. So with all this, feminist ethicists, feminist philosophers endeavor to explore and develop moral accounts that are attentive to the ethical and gender dimensions of our lives. We have to realize, we have to take note that gender is always intersected with other social divisions. Issues of gender, issues of women, issues of race, they can't be reflected on, in isolation, because these are all related, interlocking. So feminist approaches to ethics, they aim to understand moral agents, their decisions, and deliberations in the context of a broader social and political practices. And this further emphasizes that ethical theorizing should not be independent of material realities of social contexts and even of social divisions which mark our identities. Feminist ethics has greatly developed throughout the years, where it developed the perspective of care ethics, care-focused feminism. Of course, there are wide varieties of feminist approaches to ethics. As we mentioned a while ago, there's no one way of doing feminism. And we can see it here in feminist ethics. There are approaches that are care-focused. It's about maternal ethics, political feminist ethics, lesbian ethics, and status-oriented ethics, to name a few. So all these approaches, they share a common goal of articulating a gendered ethics which identifies discriminatory practices, gender biases, and they promote responses and alternatives to achieve women's emancipation. So furthermore, it continued to engage in practical matters and issues of women, such as abortion rights, rape, sexual violence, sexism, and so on.